Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, you're very welcome to our distinguished lecture series today under the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies. Our speaker today is Lord Guthrie, who is our Chancellor here at Liverpool Hope, but is known for a number of other roles as well. I'd like to just spend a few moments introducing him, if I may, and then I'm going to pass over to him as such. Field Marshal Charles Guthrie, or Baron Guthrie of Craigiebank, as he's known, was the Chief of the General Staff, known as the professional head of the British Army between 1994 and 1997, and Chief of the Defence Staff between 1997 and 2001. He's had a highly distinguished academic military career. I should add also an academic one along the way. He was educated originally at Harrow School and then at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He's seen service in the Welsh Guards and the Special Air Service. He's been closely associated with or involved in military operations in Northern Ireland. He's provided advice to the British government during the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War. He's served in a number of overseas postings over the years, indeed in Aden, the Persian Gulf, Malaysia, East Africa, Cyprus, Germany, even the New Hebrides, and also Northern Ireland, close to home. He spent a number of years then working overseas, but has also worked in London at various points in time. Indeed, was General Colonel and General Staff of Military Operations at the Ministry of Defence in London. So in a number of periods overseas and at home. His army career has stemmed to being commander of the Northern Army Group and the British Army of the Rhine in 1992. He was then promoted to full general in 1992, became ADC to the Queen. He was Chief of General Staff, as I said, on the 15th of March 1994. So he's held a number of roles. He's advised the British government on a number of occasions, particularly on the deployment of troops during the Bosnian War. He went on to be Chief of the Defence Staff in 1997, in which role he advised the British government on the conduct of the Kosovo War before retiring in 2001. However, if you think 2001 he retired, actually it's not quite true really, I don't think. He's gone on from there to be in the House of Lords. He's been one of the several retired chiefs who's spoken out in the House of Lords about the risks of servicemen facing liability for actions before the International Criminal Court, particularly in respect to the invasion of Iraq. He was created a life peer as Baron Guthrie of Craigiebank in the city of Dundee in June 2001, and he sits at the crossbench in the House of Lords. So he's always been active and is still so. He's a commentator today. He holds a number of roles outside of the University of Military Settings and charitable organisations. And last but not least, he's one of only two people to hold the honorary rank of Field Marshal. In June 2012, he was appointed to this honorary rank. So we're delighted today to welcome him here. The topic of this talk today, just to give you it, is the just war, the morals and ethics one must consider before going to war. And I think a particularly appropriate topic in the context of the type of ongoing conflicts throughout the world, particularly in areas like the Central African Republic today, in Congo still, in Syria today, given the peace talks going on. I think the backdrop is highly appropriate. So with no more ado, I'd like to honour the Lord Guthrie, our Chancellor, and ask him to hear his talk, please.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, which makes me sound, I think, extremely old. My father would have been proud of that introduction, and my mother would have believed it. I'm just hanging on, and I think I left my spectacles in my overcoat. I'm not going to talk to a very long time, because I think on this kind of subject, the most interesting thing is to have a discussion, if not a disagreement. And I suspect we can probably have both. I want to talk today about the just war, what the traditions of a just war are, and I want to talk about the epics in modern warfare. I think they are controversial subjects now. With recent conflicts, some of which we British have been involved, there has been a great deal of discussion whether we should have got involved at all. For instance, should we have gone into Libya by bombing Libya? What are we going to do about Syria? A whole lot of regions in the world which are in turmoil, and can we really make a difference? 10 years ago, I wrote a book with Sir Michael Quinlan, who was a noted scholar, a staunch Catholic, and he'd been a colleague of mine in the Ministry of Defence. We didn't write the book just because at the time we rated the Iraq War was raging, because we felt that the tradition of a just war needed revisiting. Had it actually stood the test of time? And was the world now so different that it was no longer relevant? What is the definition of a war? I think the meaning in some ways has changed over the years. Today, especially in America, there's a war against poverty, a war against drugs, against cancer, against AIDS, against crime. And I think one should note that none of these wars have been won so far, or look like being won. The term war is used fairly loosely, but I'm not going to be pedantic, and I'm going to refer to war and go and refer to war as it used to be, when it meant wars between nation states, wars which were declared, which had truces and peace treaties, when soldiers wore uniforms, nations surrendered, and it was easier to detect who the victors and the vanquished were. When the Cold War came to an end, many people felt a new time had come. Conflict would be rare, and with the threat of World War III disappearing, the traditions should be questioned. Were they still relevant? In armed conflict, some of the normal ethical rules have to be overridden. Rules such as not killing other people. War is a very, very bad way of resolving disagreements. War is ghastly, and it's inevitable that in war, terrible things happen. Things which in any other context would be utterly intolerable. But this cannot mean that anything goes. From the earliest time, almost every society has had to face up to the reality of war, and at the same time has some accompanying notion, however incomplete or crude it may seem, to modernize, of moral limitations applying to war. In the ancient world, in Greece, for instance, there was a recognition that even in the fiercest struggles, there were some things that absolutely ought not to be done, such as poisoning water supplies, cutting down the other side's olive trees, because they would take so long to grow again, and executing those who had nothing whatsoever to do with fighting, women and children. Medieval warfare had some rules, but many of them were about chivalry and matters purely concerned with fighting. For instance, there was a tradition which certainly could not be called ethical, but in a siege, if those who were being besieged continued to fight, when they had the opportunity to surrender, the population, including women and children, would be slaughtered once the attacking force seized the castle or town they were besieging. Although terrible things still did happen from time to time, mostly they were recognized as being wrong by most people for most of the time. All the great religions and nationalist humanists have contributed to setting limits. Thinking's been developed over hundreds of years on moral values, rules and understanding to govern and restrain the use of military force. But I think it's really Christian thinkers who have written most about the just war tradition, even though, I'm afraid, the historical record of Christians observing it faithfully is far, far from unblemished. Islamic thinking about the ethics in public affairs in some ways are markedly different from those of Christianity, and its teaching about war cannot be tightly compared with our just war tradition. Many of the concepts in the Islamic tradition can be found in the sacred texts of the Quran itself and other holy books and texts. In Islam, there's a central emphasis on the primacy of peace, especially peace within the worldwide Muslim community. The key concept of jihad means effort or striving. It does not necessarily mean taking up arms, but it does not exclude that as a duty in the right circumstances. War is in itself evil, but divine law regulates it rather than forbids it. It can be justified to prevent the triumph of greater evil. There have been occasional voices in the Islamic world, particularly in modern times, whose claims about what justifies the use of violence and what methods are legitimate, for example, relating to the death of non-combatants, are sharply at variance with the just war tradition. Yet those voices are very few when you look at the majority and the accepted norm within Islam. The Jewish pattern of thinking about contemporary war has historically been less fully developed than either the Christian or the Islamic traditions. This, I suspect, largely reflects the fact that for nearly 2,000 years the Jews had no sovereign state of their own, and therefore no direct occasion to form a practical, operational effort of war. Elements of the just war tradition underlie much of the international laws of war accepted by all member states of the United Nations. Many historians believe that early Christians, a minority in the Roman Empire, were predominantly pacifists. But when the Emperor Constantine came to power in the 4th century, adopting Christianity itself, Christians had to face up to and work out the tough, awkward, practical responsibilities of running and serving the state and protecting its citizens. Christians who had been outsiders in the Roman Empire were now part of it. Many famous figures, St. Augustine and Hitler in the 5th century, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, gave their mind to these problems. What should be done in the face of armed aggression and oppression in human affairs? What should be done about the barbarian hordes, Attila and his sons invading Europe from the east in the 5th century, or the Moors spreading Islam from North Africa by the sword across the Mediterranean and up across Spain into France in the 7th and 8th centuries. The very idea that Attila, the enemy, was approaching Moorgate was a fact. He was there. His record was well known. Everybody would die who was in his path. Christians had to decide what to do about it. And the just warfares believed that it simply could not be right to lay down as an absolute moral rule that armed resistance to Attila or his like was forbidden. How could any sensible person advocate pacifism if lives could be saved and genocide avoided? Just war is not a doctrine decreed from on high. It's not a law. It's a tradition. It recognizes that while war can never be positively good, it's not always the worst thing. Ethnic cleansing, genocide, and wholesale slaughter is almost certainly worse. The tradition sets out a range of tests that must be satisfied if war is to be morally justified. And the criteria fall into two groups. The right to fight, in Latin jus ad bellum, which concerns the morality of going to war at all. The second group, jus in bellum, concerns the morality of what is actually done in a war. How is it to be waged? And there's 6 criteria in the first group which have to be satisfied and taken into account before embarking on armed conflict. Firstly, you have to have a just cause, a proper reason for going to war. It could be to protect the innocent, to stop genocide. This could be said to have applied to our activities when I was serving in Sierra Leone or in Kosovo. It could be to restore rights wrongfully denied. It could be to re-establish just order. And of course, it could be self-defense, self-preservation. And reasons such as revenge and the desire to punish or to eliminate your enemy are not just causes. We could have a discussion about Syria and Libya later. Could it be regime change? This was a topical and controversial subject with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a bad man, running a bad regime. But Iraq was not a failed state. Was it up to us to topple him? Have we actually made things better? Secondly, you must have a proportionate cause. The case for going to war must be weightier enough to warrant a massive step of engaging in armed conflict. It's not good enough to go to war if you believe one of our citizens has been cheated, his holiday house or property confiscated, or the national flag has been burnt by a mob, or the President of the United States or the Queen has been insulted. We must have a reasonable expectation that the outcome will entail enough good to outweigh the inevitable pain and destruction of war. I always think of the war of Jenkins' Ear. When Spain and England went to war, we were itching to fight Spain and to have a war with them. And when Spanish coast guards cut off a sailor called Jenkins' Ear, we had an excuse to go to war, and we did. Third, we must have the right intention. Our aim must be to create a better, more just, and more lasting peace than there would have been had we not gone to war. Fourthly, of state, the ruler or governor or sovereign state. And that's not so straightforward today. In 1945, the Charter of the United Nations laid down that countries have a right to take up arms in self-defense, and that external military action going beyond that must be taken only with the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. The failure of the UN has been due not only to the bad behavior of particular countries, although goodness, over the past 60 years there's been plenty of that, and because of the shortcomings inherent in the present composition and power of veto within the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Any one of the members can block a resolution. It's not surprising that the Security Council can't always agree. National interests often prevail. They did in the Balkans, they did in Syria, and any number of other places one can think of. I believe Rwanda, Kosovo, and many commentators would add Darfur, and now we have Syria, where the widespread desires for more determined humanitarian interventions have been held back by a perceived likelihood of a veto by China or Russia or France in the Security Council. Security does show us that a rigid, absolute insistence on the Security Council clearance can, at present, be incompatible with a proper recognition of the world's practical and moral realities. But this is a very difficult area. I personally think the Russians were rather more sensible about Syria than we were. The fifth criterion is that there must be a reasonable possibility of success. If a war's likely result is simply death and suffering, without making things materially better, we shouldn't take up arms. Death before dishonor is not right. However, this criteria is a good example that it may not always be right to slavishly follow the just war traditions. In 1939, Finland engaged in a war with Soviet Russia. A war they could not possibly win, but undoubtedly they achieved a far better deal by fighting than they would have if they had just capitulated. The sixth and final criterion is last resort. We mustn't take up arms unless we've tried or have good reason for ruling out as likely to be ineffective every other way of securing our just cause. But this doesn't mean that war is not to be embarked upon until every other option, however unrealistic, has been tried. It would be unreasonable to demand that every conceivable non-military instrument must have been exhaustively tested, irrespective of whether it's likely to work. Dropping leaflets on an enemy who is just about to kill you is not wise. There comes a point when diplomats and politicians are getting nowhere with negotiations. Negotiations proving fruitless, with no prospect of success. And negotiation must stop, and military action becomes paramount, hopefully, however, for not too long. As a soldier, I was sometimes irritated by politicians who allowed situations to deteriorate because they went on talking when there was absolutely no hope of having a solution through peaceful means. I remember having a disagreement, I think I call it, with John Major and Douglas Hurd, who were very reluctant to go into Yugoslavia. Nobody wanted to go into Yugoslavia. But the longer we held it, the worse the situation And I think 200,000 Yugoslavs might be alive today if we had gone in there earlier and stopped the initial trouble. Now, if those 6 criteria should be taken into account before going to war, then there are 2 criteria under use in them, how one should behave during the war. First, discrimination. This means that in the conduct of war, we must not deliberately attack the innocent. Innocent means those not involved in harming us or helping to harm us. But it's not easy to define innocence. In 1991, I think it was absolutely legitimate to target the reluctant Iraqi conscripts facing the United Nations forces. The relevant fact was that they were there to help do harm and were killing people, mostly Kuwaiti civilians. But are civilians innocent who provide logistic support to the armed forces? Are workers in armament factories? All these people seem plainly involved. Are the broadcasters putting out a hostile regime's propaganda? We can remember the television station in Belgrade being destroyed. Is an old lady knitting socks for her grandson who's serving in the front line? Surely not. Disarmed captives? Almost certainly not. But they could be if the captives outnumbered their captors and began lynching their armed guards. So there's much to debate in this area too. There's not a tidy solution. And remember, terrorists rarely wear uniform and look like the innocent civilians they're amongst, and perhaps using them as a shield. Tidy rules are impossible, but honest judgments have to be made. General attack on a native population in order to weaken the nation's resolve surely is wrong. Increasingly, we look back at the bombing of Dresden as wrong, and other raids by Bomb Command. They happened towards the end of the war, when the final outcome of our victory was clear. The morality of Bomber Harris's campaign we argued about for many years. And a lot of people who believe that he was quite right. And I think it's much easier to judge Bomber Harris if you were around at the time, as opposed to sitting in comfort here. We mustn't do things, however legitimate in themselves, if in our honest, considered opinion, the good they achieve is likely to be outweighed by the harm inflicted on those who ought not to be harmed. It's entirely legitimate to knock out an enemy tank, but if the enemy tank is hiding in a large hospital complex or in a school, it's not permissible to flatten everything to ensure the tank is destroyed. What we must avoid is creating a vacuum after hostilities are over. If one fails to do this, there is a danger of this void being filled by the ill-intentioned, as happened in Iraq, as happened in Afghanistan, in certain areas in recent times. The post-conflict phase, these judges, lawyers, policemen, prison officers, diplomats, doctors, aid workers, civil engineers, vets and economists. And soldiers are not well trained in these tasks. But too often, they're likely to be the only people around to do the end of the war. Perhaps the greatest failure of Iraq and Afghanistan is the lack of policy and coordination effort once the real fighting was over. Military aid, foreign and political policy had to be coordinated, and quite honestly, it hasn't always happened. And I think that after the Second Iraq War, the United States made a terrible mistake by not planning what they would do afterwards. They would leave Iraq to themselves. When the Allies went into Kosovo, I seem to remember only one NGO was ready to go with them. A year later, there were over 400 such organizations in Kosovo. One of the great problems about war and armed conflict is that they have unforeseen consequences. The outcome is difficult to predict, and one of our traditions is to make things better. It's not like a play in a theatre where there's a script and we know what the ending will be. But we have to be prepared for the unexpected. We have to plan. And I think, as I said, the greatest indictment of the Second Iraq War was the lack of planning after it was over. Conflict is dangerous and frightening. But what happens afterwards, after fighting, is usually more complicated, goes on for longer, and ends up by being even more expensive than the war itself. And I think Iraq and Afghanistan are excellent examples of this. Most conflict resolution is very, very difficult. A Roman writer, Tacitus, talks of the victorious creating a desert and calling it a peace. That cannot be right. One must strive to create a better solution. In conclusion, the tradition of a just war doesn't yield a tidy, unambiguous answer to every question. Terrible problems and dilemmas have to be faced, and those who lead are faced with horrific decisions, sometimes based on sparse evidence, and decisions which have to be taken very quickly. The just war calls for judgment, often contestable in good faith, on matters lying well beyond the expertise of moral philosophers. It is, I think, simply a systematic reminder of the kind of questions we ought to think about when we're considering embarking upon armed conflict or when we engage in it. One recognizes not everybody will consider moral questions, but it's surely beyond argument that some framework analysis of war is necessary. Politicians and generals need to understand that what the just war tradition means and avoid sliding into wars without understanding. The possible consequences are not always clear. Intervention is comparatively easy when compared with conflict resolution. Now, those who reject the just war approach, and there will be those who will continue to do so, have to face and answer the question of is there other inevitable roadmap they propose to put in its place. Conflict has changed, weapons are more terrible, but I believe the tradition of the just war is still relevant, and we abandon it, and the moral and ethical issues at our peril. Now, I'm delighted to answer questions, a discussion. Disagreement is always good fun. So, the floor is yours.
Can I just say, on behalf of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies, on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University, thank you very much for this really inspiring talk, and we're obviously very happy to take questions. You've got Bethany at the back who's got a microphone, so if you just want to raise your hands, and Bethany will be around the microphone.
There's one there.
Thank you very much, Guthrie, for your lecture. I have been concerned for a long time, I'm sure many people have, about the relationship between politicians and the senior military personnel and the influence that one group has on the other. The elected personnel certainly don't seem to have made terrific decisions in the last few years, that's for certain. And as one of your criteria was that you should have a good chance of winning, which does seem sensible and logic, playing Afghanistan on their own territory is like playing Real Madrid on theirs every Saturday, because history tells us that fighting Afghanistan is very fruitless. Look at the Russians recently. I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I was for going into Afghanistan, and the SAS and the American Special Forces did exactly what I expected them to do. They destroyed the Al-Qaeda camps, and that is what the problem was. The Taliban were not the problem there. We stayed in Afghanistan, and having destroyed the Al-Qaeda camps, which the SAS and the Americans did very well, we should have actually left. It was right to destroy the Al-Qaeda camps because they were responsible for so much bombing, so much terrorism, which was happening in the United States, in Africa, and in the United Kingdom. The bombings in London were done and planned in Afghanistan, and no nation can allow that sort of thing to go on. So we destroyed them. What we should have done is told the Afghans, if you're allowed to build it up, we'll come back and do it again. But we had completely unrealistic goals, I think, about democracy. They aren't ready for democracy, they don't want democracy. About destroying the poppy crop. Of course we don't want them to have poppies, but huge areas are covered in poppies there. And if you do destroy those poppies, the Afghans are going to go hungry, because that's their only source of income. And it is very easy to say, well, let's give them something else. The Americans had a plan of Monsanto, the great fruit company, to introduce pineapples where the poppies were. But who wants a pineapple to sell a pineapple when you can get so much money for poppies? And there were a whole many things which we were unrealistic about. We also are not prepared to make the kind of commitment which is needed in Afghanistan. There are a handful of people that are really, when you see what a big country it is and how difficult it is to operate in. So my view is it was right to destroy the camp, and then we should have gone out, and I'm very sorry, but that is how they want to govern themselves. It seems very hard-hearted, but don't go to war unless you're going to win.
Well, Guthrie, you served yourself in Northern Ireland. Did you have any reflections on the recent revelations of British covert or counterinsurgency tactics in Northern Ireland and the relationship of that to the notion of just war?
Well, I think all wars are different. I think there were mistakes made early on. I think that, for instance, internment was a terrible mistake, and we were not clever at handling things. To tell you the truth, most British people were very ignorant about Northern Ireland. They knew it was a funny system. They had their own prime minister. They couldn't quite work that out. And I think if they had known how the factions aligned themselves with what they stood for, they would have been very shocked. I was in Northern Ireland 5 times, twice in Belfast, twice in South Armagh, and once in Derry. It was a very difficult situation because the IRA were very very sophisticated terrorist organization. And to go there, I think we made mistakes. We didn't really understand what we were up against. And in the early days, we were using the sort of tactics which I remember using when we were fighting in Myanmar. Well, the facts are endlessly patrolling top of the hills in Northern Ireland was not doing us much good because the IRA didn't go to the top of the hills. They tended to stay in the towns, and our intelligence was weak. But it was a horrible situation. There were countries outside who were getting involved, the Libyans, some elements of the United States. It was a very difficult thing to do. I am free to admit, when I went out there in the first wave of 1969, I was enormously surprised by what I found. I was the last commander of South Myanmar, which is a very tricky area. We learned a great deal. Why did it come to an end? I think that's interesting. You hear lots of reasons. I came to the conclusion that it had actually started by the women in the families in Derry who were fed up with having their families either killed or locked up, their menfolk. And of course, the greatest killer of those people were the Protestant paramilitaries, who were extremely dangerous, very brutal. So I think that, we learned a lot. It calmed down. It calmed down because people realized after a bit the killing had to stop and people were to go to school and their families were to survive. So I think most people have a bit of a say in it. But it was serious. I mean, the number of soldiers killed there, I had 9 Welsh guardsmen killed in the morning in South Myanmar, which was the kind of thing we didn't actually see in the conflicts that were going on in either Afghanistan or Iraq and that sort of thing. Okay? Yeah.
Well, Guthrie, this may be left field, so forgive me. I wanted to ask you, some time ago I read a fascinating book by Michael Gambler called The States of Exception, which some colleagues of mine may know about. And it really sort of considers whether there's any justification for governments or ideological powers to create an exception to their own rule of law in a given circumstance. I suppose rendition might be one of those. I suppose some of the recent revelations as just in Northern Ireland may also sort of be a sort of state of exception. I just wondered what your view was about that, because of course it's in principle inevitable.
Well, I think the best example I can give is an example of torture.
Yes.
I have written in the Times and the Financial Times and the Economist about it. I was rather shocked when I said I was going to write about torture. Somebody said, is it how you're going to do it? In actual fact, I so deplore waterboarding. I think it is the most terrible thing. And I think it's very counterproductive, actually. One of the principal Al-Qaeda operatives has been waterboarded 142 times. And I know what they say. Americans say they've got a lot of information. I'm not so sure that they have, because people who are tortured usually will tell you anything that you want to hear. But the damage it has done Guantanamo has done to the United States, I think is incalculable, because people look to the United States as being a country which has proper standards, proper human rights. In fact, they say these people don't deserve human rights, you know. It's almost as though they weren't human beings. Some waterboarding, and some of them are wicked and should be stamped on. I'm not saying the British Army hasn't done terrible things from time to time, but we have to take a very, very tough line, I think.
I'm just wondering, how would you update Just War theory for the 21st century and make it more?
Could you speak up a little bit?
How would you update Just War theory for the 21st century and make it more appropriate to today's conflict?
How would I update warfare?
Just War theory.
Well, I think that a lot of it is still very relevant. I think that people have to understand you can't have absolutely black and white rules, and people will look for just war tradition in different ways. I didn't work with you, but somebody asked me a question I didn't really answer about do politicians and generals really get on. I think the generals are sometimes unreasonable and expect more and hoard equipment and want more. You will never absolutely satiate a general's appetite for more. But I think one of the tragic things about our country now is we've had governments who have no feel for war and have no feel for what the consequences of war and the danger of unforeseen consequences. I also think in our case it was a mistake to always go along with the United States over the last few years. I am a great supporter of the Atlantic Alliance, but Atlantic Alliance doesn't mean to say we always have to be nice and agree with the United States. I think that people who say that I don't really need a special relationship except in intelligence, except in military, except in nuclear things, I think the Americans always do what they want if it's really serious. So I don't really believe it, but I think that we've got to be aware. Don't always do things because it's America. Harold Wilson didn't go to Vietnam. That didn't really spoil our relations. Churchill had the most frightful rows in World War II with the Americans. Attlee had a row. So I think that we have to stand up for what we believe are right. And I think, in a way, we'd be more helpful to the United States by doing that than sometimes doing what the United States wants. That shocked a lot of people.
Thank you, Lord Guthrie. You might call me a cynic, but I follow Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and I watch multiple TV channels. And I actually question what I sometimes see as propaganda being spread, but actually some people don't, and they believe what they see on TV might be true. And it's not unless you're on the ground with individuals, maybe in areas of conflict, which you know the true facts. So very often people believe what they see, and others don't believe what they see. So do politicians get it right? Do generals get it right? And where do they base their information on that's coming in hard and fast? And just one final thing. Do you think that we still have an empire? Because I very often hear certain individuals say Liverpool was the second city of the empire. And the empire doesn't really exist. Or does it exist in the minds of some senior industrialists, politicians, generals, etc.?
Well, I think that I agree that the empire doesn't exist, but on the other hand, a lot of the attitudes, a lot of the culture of what used to be the empire is still around. People think like we do, and that is a huge advantage. And I'm a great admirer of how the Queen deals with the empire. The empire could, I think, be a greater force for good in the world than it actually is. But I do recognize that this is not a powerful organization which is prepared to invade some foreign country and beat somebody up because they're not trading properly. So you're absolutely right about that. As far as generals and politicians are concerned, believe it or not, there's human beings, and they do make mistakes. I think what worries me about politicians in the military, so few of them begin to understand what being in the service is like, and what being under fire is like, and what having your friends wounded. The terrible stories we have in Afghanistan of people being very badly wounded. I sometimes wonder whether politicians really get it. I think our present Prime Minister thinks he gets it, but I'm not quite sure who's advising him. So I'm very disappointed. I was even more disappointed with Gordon Brown. I thought Tony Blair began to understand it, but such a loss. The problem is, we got to media here. Anyhow, you get the gist of what I'm saying.
There was a question on that side.
I've read that in the past you've stated that army leaders should be free to have the element of surprise when initiating war. And I just wondered how that fits with an ethical approach to warfare, and if you still agree with that.
You'll be reading The Guardian, haven't you? I was attacked by some fellow in The Guardian to say that I thought surprise attack was on many occasions a very good thing. Because if people have this idea that warfare is like cricket, it happens on a flat surface. You have 11 people on each side. You each give a turn to bat. I had this trouble in Yugoslavia when we were bombing, and people said it's most unfair because the aircraft are so high they can't shoot them down. This is not cricket. This is very serious of us trying to get a solution as quickly as possible and trying to turn things normally. So what I think this Guardian article, which you obviously studied, says, I said that I thought for drones were not actually as evil as a lot of people say, people in Pakistan in particular. Why don't I say that? Well, it seems to me a rather sensible way of doing something, because you're not risking people. What is difficult is actually targeting the drones, and that's where the mistakes happen, and they're very, very regrettable. But everyone which is badly targeted, even though most are not, I think it'll get better, but they are a fact of life, they're here. So there's no point saying, oh well, it's unfair. I think the Guardian accused me of war crimes or something, but I slide it.
Any final question?
Hello, Lord Guthrie. Is the prospect of unlimited oil, has that been part of the reason why we went into Afghanistan and Iran and etc.
I think it's a complete myth, quite honestly. That was put around and we did it for wicked capitalists from the West who were trying to seize the oil. I think that's untrue. In actual fact, the oil hasn't flowed as freely since people went in there. But it was certainly something which was put about. I can promise you, the time of the First World War and the time of the Second World War, I never heard that mentioned once.
Great. I think that's our time up really for the talk, but I would really like to thank Guthrie for really inspiring us this afternoon. Can you just join me?
Thank you, Lord Guthrie. May I also add my thanks for that wonderful lecture. It was a highly expansive review of the topic. I think the insights around the military aspects of conflict, and particularly from a military perspective, it is a real dilemma in war situations, and the relationship between politicians and generals is quite a fascinating subject. I know in some of the work I've done peacekeeping, it's one of those really tricky subjects. The relationship on the ground, even in post-conflict situations between the military and the political representatives, is quite challenging to say the least. Those situations, as Lord Guthrie said, are often more complex. Sometimes the more peace is a very difficult thing to achieve on the ground and return to normality, as he's highlighted in the context of Northern Ireland. So, with no more doubt to thank him for that, I thank you also for your questions and coming today. I'll let you inform you that there is afternoon tea after this event downstairs in the HCA common room, the Hill of Constant Allen common room. So it's just at the bottom of the stairs when you go down. And I hope you'll join us for that. And my thanks to Dr. Stephanie Campbell for the organisation behind this event and her colleagues in the War and Peace Centre, especially for the microphone. So thank you.